Subscribe now, because what you're about to read will prove that sometimes standing up for yourself is the sexiest thing you can do. The exhausted marketing assistant finally snaps at her incompetent manager in front of the new ruthless billionaire CEO, then accidentally dumps hot coffee all over him during her dramatic resignation. She expects to be escorted out by security. Instead, he offers her the job of a lifetime and confesses feelings that will turn her world completely upside down. This story has workplace drama, power dynamics that will make your heart race, a love confession on a rooftop under the stars, public declarations that defy corporate norms, and an ending so romantic you'll believe that the person meant for you will see your worth even when you're at your absolute lowest. Don't miss a single word of this incredible journey from humiliated employee to corporate director to beloved fiancé of a man who would burn down the world to protect her dignity. The January. Frost gripped Chicago in its icy embrace when Kira Matthews stepped off the crowded L train at the Adams Wabash station. Her breath turned to white vapor, and her fingers clenched tighter around the plastic coffee cup she'd bought from a small cafe near her apartment in Logan Square. She was 28 years old with dark brown hair tied in a tight bun and honey-colored eyes that were dark-circled this morning after another sleepless night. She walked quickly toward the glass tower that loomed over the area like a monument to modern capitalism. Morrison Tower, as Chicago residents called it, housed the main headquarters of Morrison Industries, one of the largest technology corporations in North America. Kira had worked there for 3 years as an assistant in the marketing department, and every day she crossed those same revolving doors with a mixture of pride and anxiety. This morning, however, something was different. Tension hung in the air that she'd sensed from the moment she entered the marble lobby. The receptionist, usually smiling Maggie, gave her only a short, meaningful glance and quickly looked away. At the elevators, a group of employees whispered among themselves, and their conversations went silent immediately when Kira approached. She took the elevator to the 23rd floor where her department was located. The corridor was unusually quiet for a Monday morning. Usually at this time, you could hear the buzzing of phones, clicking of keyboards, and muted conversations by the coffee machine. Today, however, an atmosphere of waiting for a storm prevailed. Kira reached her desk and set down her purse on the back of her chair. Her colleague, Sophie, sitting at the neighboring workstation, looked up and gazed at her with an expression Kira knew all too well, a look full of sympathy mixed with relief that she wasn't in the crosshairs. "What's going on?" Kira asked quietly, looking around the open space office which seemed strangely depopulated. Sophie leaned toward her and lowered her voice to a whisper. "Haven't you heard? Old man Morrison retired Friday evening. The official announcement was only this morning, but rumors have been circulating since the weekend. His son is taking over. Carson Morrison, the one who's been running the Berlin office for the last 5 years. Kira felt her stomach clench in a knot. She'd heard about Carson Morrison. Everyone in the company had heard about him. 34 years old, Oxford and Harvard business. School graduate, the man who'd transformed the struggling German division of the company into a money-making machine. It was said he was brilliant but ruthless, that he didn't tolerate mistakes or excuses, that he could fire entire departments with one stroke of a pen if he decided they weren't bringing sufficient profits. "That's not all," Sophie continued, nervously playing with her pen. "Apparently he's already reviewed reports from all departments, and apparently our marketing department is on his list for restructuring. They're saying he plans to fire half the team." Kira closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Over the last 3 years, she'd given her all to this company. She'd stayed after hours, taken on extra projects, never complained about low pay or lack of promotion. She'd done it all because she needed this job. After her mother's death 2 years ago, she'd been left alone with the mortgage and bills that didn't pay themselves. "What time is the meeting?" she asked, opening her eyes and straightening her back. If she had to face the new CEO, she intended to do it with dignity. "In an hour. All department heads and their direct reports are supposed to appear in the conference room on the 30th floor. Kira nodded and sat at her desk. She turned on her computer and began reviewing her recent reports, looking for anything that might work in her favor. For the next 50 minutes, she analyzed data, checked results of campaigns she'd led, and gathered arguments that might convince the new CEO she was a valuable employee. When the time came, she stood up from her desk and smoothed her navy blue skirt. She checked that her blouse was properly buttoned and her bun was in place. She took a notepad and pen, then headed toward the elevators with a group of other employees who looked just as nervous as she was. The conference room on the 30th floor was spacious and modern with panoramic windows overlooking downtown Chicago. A long table, with a glass top, could accommodate about 30 people. But this morning, chairs were arranged along the walls, and employees stood in groups, talking in hushed voices. Kira stood by the window and looked at the city spreading out below her feet. She saw Willis Tower, the skyscrapers of the business district, the ribbon of the Chicago River glinting in winter sunlight. For a moment she allowed herself a moment of calm before the conference room doors opened, and he walked in. Carson Morrison was taller than she'd imagined. He measured at least 6'3". He had broad shoulders and the physique of someone who regularly visited the gym. His hair was dark blonde, cut short on the sides and slightly longer on top. He had sharp facial features, high cheekbones, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from stone. But his eyes attracted the most attention. They were steel blue, cold and penetrating, and seemed to see everything at once. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, white shirt without a tie, and black leather shoes that shone under the fluorescent lights. He walked with the confident stride of a man accustomed to the world stepping out of his way. Behind him entered a middle-aged woman with a tablet in her hands, and two men in suits who looked like lawyers or advisors. The entire room fell silent, and Kira felt the air thicken with tension. Carson stood at the head of the room and for a long moment observed those gathered. His gaze moved across, where employees' faces like a scanner, analyzing and evaluating each one separately. When his eyes met Kira's gaze, he stopped for a fraction of a second longer, then moved on. "My name is Carson Morrison," he began in a low, confident voice. "As of today, I'm CEO of Morrison Industries. My father built this company for 40 years, and I'm grateful to him for that. But times are changing, and the company must change with them if it wants to survive." He paused and looked around the room. "Over the last week, I've analyzed results from all departments. Some are impressive. Others are, to put it mildly, disappointing." Kira felt her heart begin to beat faster. She knew the marketing department hadn't had the best results last quarter. The budget had been cut, the team reduced, and expectations remained the same. She'd done what she could, but miracles were beyond her reach. "Marketing department," Carson continued, and Kira felt all eyes in the room turn toward her. "Over the last 18 months, your results have dropped by 23%. Campaign costs have risen while return on investment has fallen. Who can explain this to me?" The silence that fell was almost tangible. The department head, Mr. Thomas Whitmore, a man in his 50s with thinning hair and a nervous tick in his eye, began to stammer. "Mr. Morrison, I mean, market conditions were difficult and the budget was decreased and—" Carson raised his hand, silencing him with one gesture. "Market conditions are difficult for everyone. I'm asking about specific actions you took to adapt." Mr. Whitmore began to sweat. Kira saw drops of perspiration forming on his forehead and felt a mixture of sympathy and frustration. Over the last year, she'd proposed new strategies to him multiple times, new approaches, new solutions. Each time she'd heard that the budget wouldn't allow it, that management wouldn't agree, that it was better not to risk it. "I prepared the analyses for the department," she heard her own voice before she could stop herself. Everyone looked at her, including Carson, whose steel eyes bored into her with an intensity that almost physically pushed her back. "And who are you?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "Kira Matthews, assistant in the marketing department. An assistant who prepares analyses," he said. "Please continue, Ms. Matthews." Kira swallowed and took a step forward. She felt everyone's gaze on her, but she focused only on Carson's cold blue eyes. "Over the last, year, I've presented proposals for new marketing strategies that could increase our reach on social media and improve conversion rates. Unfortunately, none were implemented due to budget constraints." Carson raised an eyebrow. "Where are these proposals?" "In the system. I can send them to you." For a long moment he looked at her in silence, then nodded. "Please do so by end of day today. Now we move to the next point." The meeting lasted another 2 hours. Carson went through each department with surgical precision, asking questions that exposed weaknesses and incompetence. Several people left the room with faces pale as a wall, knowing their days at the company were numbered. When the meeting ended, Kira returned to her desk and immediately set about sending her proposals to the new CEO. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, compiling documents, charts, and analyses she'd prepared over recent months. She was just about to press send when a shadow appeared over her desk. She looked up and saw Mr. Whitmore standing over her with a face red with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed, leaning over her. "Undermining my authority in front of the new CEO?" Kira felt something break inside her. For years she'd endured his incompetence, his unwillingness to change, his tendency to take credit for her ideas when they succeeded, and blame her when something went wrong. "I told the truth," she replied calmly, though her heart was pounding like a hammer. "Those proposals exist. They're in the system. Anyone can check." Mr. Whitmore brought his face close to hers. His breath smelled of coffee and something sour that made her nauseous. "Listen to me carefully, little girl," he hissed through clenched teeth. "I've worked at this company for 15 years. You're nobody, an assistant I can replace in one day. If you think you can undermine me—" "Mr. Whitmore," they heard a voice behind them that made them both freeze. It was a voice cold as a January, morning and sharp as a razor. Carson Morrison stood a few steps away with arms crossed over his chest and an expression that boded nothing good. "Am I interrupting something?" he asked with apparent courtesy that was more terrifying than an overt threat. Mr. Whitmore straightened abruptly and smoothed his jacket. "Mr. Morrison, this is just a misunderstanding between employees." Carson looked at him long and carefully, then shifted his gaze to Kira. "Is everything all right, Ms. Matthews?" Kira nodded, not trusting her voice. "Good. Mr. Whitmore, please come to my office immediately." Both men left, and Kira was left alone with her galloping heart and trembling hands. She didn't know yet that this day would prove to be a turning point in her life, the beginning of something she couldn't have imagined even in her wildest dreams. The next morning, Kira woke at 5:30 a.m., half an hour before her alarm. She lay in the darkness of her small Logan Square apartment, listening to sounds of the waking city and trying to understand what had really happened the previous day. After Carson had taken Mr. Whitmore to his office, her supervisor had never returned to his workstation. His desk was emptied late evening by HR department employees, and rumors about his immediate dismissal spread through the company at lightning speed. She got out of bed and approached the window, pulling aside the curtain. Beyond the glass spread a view of Logan Square brownstones, their courtyards, and roofs covered with a thin layer of frost. The sky to the east was just beginning to lighten, transitioning from navy blue through violet to pale pink. Kira had always loved these moments before dawn when the city was still sleepy and quiet, and she could gather her thoughts in silence. She took a shower, dressed more carefully than usual, and ate breakfast consisting of oatmeal with apple and cinnamon. The entire time her thoughts circled around Carson Morrison, and that strange moment when their eyes had met. There was something in his gaze she couldn't define, something more than ordinary evaluation of an employee by an employer. She arrived at the company earlier than usual because she wanted to avoid gossip and whispers that would certainly accompany her throughout the day. The lobby was almost empty at this hour. Only security guards sat at the reception desk, sipping coffee from paper cups. She took the elevator to her floor and sat at her desk, turning on her computer. In her inbox waited a message that made her heart stop for a moment. The sender was Carson Morrison, and the subject read simply, "Meeting today, 8 a.m., my office." Kira looked at her watch. It was 6:45 a.m. She had an hour and 15 minutes to prepare for a meeting with a man who, with one stroke of a pen, could change her life for better or worse. She opened the folder with proposals she'd sent him the previous day and began reviewing them, refreshing her memory and preparing for potential questions. 7:55 a.m. She stood before the CEO's office door on the 32nd floor. She took a deep breath, smoothed the navy blue dress she'd chosen that morning, and knocked. "Come in," she heard his voice. She pushed the door and entered the spacious office. The room was furnished in minimalist style with dominating shades of gray, white, and steel. Huge windows occupied an entire wall, offering a breathtaking view of Chicago's panorama. Carson sat behind a massive dark wood desk, reviewing documents on a tablet. When she entered, he looked up and indicated a chair opposite him. "Ms. Matthews," he began without unnecessary preliminaries, I reviewed your proposals. They're interesting. Kira sat on the edge of the chair, keeping her back straight as a rod. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. Carson set down the tablet and looked at her with those steel eyes of his. Why do you work here? The question surprised her. I'm sorry, I don't understand. It's a simple question. Why do you work here? With your qualifications and ideas, you could work in a much better place. An advertising agency, a startup, anywhere your creativity would be appreciated. Instead, you're stuck in an assistant position in a department run by an incompetent man. Why? Kira was silent for a long moment, wondering how honest she should be. I need stability, she finally answered. I have a mortgage on my apartment. After my mother's death, I was left alone with debts. I can't afford risk. Carson nodded as if this answer didn't surprise him. Sophia. Responsibility, she corrected, feeling her cheeks grow warmer. For a moment he looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Then he stood and approached the window, standing with his back to her. His silhouette was outlined in dark contrast against the bright sky. I fired Whitmore, he said quietly, not only for his incompetence but also for the way he treated you. I saw the camera footage. I heard what he said to you. Kira felt her throat tighten. There are cameras in the open space? There are cameras everywhere, Ms. Matthews. This is a corporation, not a kindergarten. He turned and leaned against the windowsill, crossing his arms over his chest. I have a proposal for you. I need someone to help me restructure the marketing department. Someone from inside who knows the people, processes, weaknesses, and strengths. Someone who has vision and courage to realize it. I think you could be that person. Kira blinked, trying to process what she'd heard. You're offering me a promotion? I'm offering you the position of interim marketing department director with triple the salary and full decision-making authority. If within 6 months you achieve the results you presented in your proposals, the position becomes permanent. If not, you return to your previous position. For a long moment, Kira couldn't utter a word. This was everything she'd dreamed of for the last 3 years. A chance to prove her worth, to realize her ideas, to step out of the shadow of incompetent supervisors. And yet something about all this didn't give her peace. Why me? She finally asked. You have dozens of experienced managers at your disposal. You could hire someone from outside, someone with reputation and experience. Why choose an assistant who's never managed a team? Carson smiled slightly, and it was the first smile she'd seen on his face. It wasn't a warm or friendly smile, but rather an expression of recognition, as if she'd just passed a test whose existence she hadn't known about. That's exactly why, he replied. Because you ask, because you think, because you don't accept gifts without thinking what price you'll have to pay for them. That's a rare trait in this environment. He approached the desk and pulled a folder from a drawer. He placed it in front of Kira and opened it, revealing a contract. Please read this at home. You have until noon tomorrow to make a decision. If you agree, we start Monday. Kira took the folder in her hand, feeling the weight of the paper and an even greater weight of responsibility associated with it. She stood and headed toward the door, but his voice stopped her mid-step. And one more thing, Ms. Matthews. She turned. Please stop being afraid. Fear is only useful when it protects us from real danger. In every other situation, it's just a burden that slows us down. For the rest of the day, Kira functioned as if in a trance. She sat at her desk, answered emails, participated in meetings, but her thoughts were elsewhere, constantly returning to the office on the 32nd floor, to Carson Morrison's steel eyes, and to the proposal that could change everything. That evening she returned to her Logan Square apartment and sat at the kitchen table with the contract spread before her. She read each paragraph carefully, looking for traps and hooks, but the document was surprisingly simple and honest. The salary was exactly as he'd promised. Authorities broad, conditions clear. She called her best friend Eva, who worked as a lawyer at a firm in the Loop. They met for coffee at a small cafe near Kira's apartment, and for 2 hours analyzed every detail of the contract. Eva sighed, setting down the last page. From a legal standpoint, I don't see any problems. It's a good contract, fair. But I have to ask you something else. What do you know about this Carson Morrison? Because from what you're telling me, this all sounds a bit like a fairy tale. A billionaire who suddenly notices a modest assistant and offers her the promotion of a lifetime. Kira stirred her coffee with a spoon, watching swirling bubbles. "I don't know what to think about it," she admitted. "There's something about him I can't figure out. He's cold and distant, but at the same time he seems to see more than he shows. It's disorienting." Eva nodded. "Be careful. People like him don't do anything without a reason. If he chose you, it's because he sees something in you he can use. The question is whether that use will benefit you both or only him." The decision. The next day, Kira woke at dawn and sat by the window for an hour, watching the waking city. She thought about her mother, who'd worked her whole life as a nurse, never complaining about low wages or difficult conditions. She thought about her father, whom she'd never known because he'd left before she was born. She thought about all the choices that had brought her here and about that one choice waiting for her today. At 10:30 a.m., she entered Carson Morrison's office and placed the signed contract on his desk. "I accept your proposal," she said, looking him straight in the eyes. Carson took the contract and scanned it, checking the signature. Then he looked up at her with that same unreadable expression she'd seen the day before. "Good," he said. "As of Monday, you're marketing department director. Please prepare yourself because a very intense period awaits you." Kira nodded and turned to leave. "Ms. Matthews," she heard behind her. She looked over her shoulder. "I won't be disappointed in you, will I?" It was a question, but it sounded like a statement, like a challenge thrown at her feet. "No," she replied with certainty she hadn't felt before. "I won't disappoint you." 3 months later, the transformation. Over the next weeks, Kira worked more intensively than ever before in her life. She came to the office at 7 a.m. and left at 10 p.m. She met with each team member individually, getting to know their strengths and weaknesses, listening to their ideas and concerns. She reorganized processes, introduced new tools, negotiated with external partners. Carson observed her progress from a distance, but every few days, he summoned her to his office for short meetings. He asked about specific projects, indicators, problems she encountered. His questions were always pointed and forced her to think. Sometimes he gave her suggestions, but never imposed his opinion. He treated her like a partner, not like a subordinate. One evening, when she sat alone in her new office reviewing reports from the last week, she heard a knock at the door. She looked up and saw Carson standing in the doorway with 2 coffee cups in his hands. "I thought you might need caffeine," he said, entering and placing 1 cup on her desk. Kira was so surprised that for a moment she didn't know what to say. "Thank you," she finally managed. Carson sat in the chair opposite her and for a long moment looked at her in silence. His steel eyes seemed softer in the office's dim lighting, almost human. "It's 9:45, he said. "You've been working 14-hour days for 3 weeks. When did you last eat a real meal?" Kira blinked. A real meal. Something other than a sandwich from a vending machine or salad from the cafeteria. She had to think about it and realized with embarrassment that she couldn't remember. "I'm working," she tried to defend herself. Carson, shook his head. "I didn't hire you to burn yourself out in the first month. You'll burn out before you achieve any results." He stood and approached the window, looking at the city's nightlights. "I know from my own experience. When I took over the Berlin division, I worked even more than you do now. I thought that was the only way I could prove my worth. I ended up in the hospital with exhaustion." He turned and looked at her. "Please go home, get some sleep, and tomorrow come at normal hours. The world won't collapse if you're not in the office at 7 a.m. Kira wanted to protest, but something in his voice stopped her. There was something personal in it, as if he genuinely cared about her. Maybe it was fatigue, maybe over-interpretation, but she felt warmth spreading in her chest. "All right," she agreed quietly. "I'll go home." She stood and began gathering her things. When she was at the door, his voice stopped her once again. "Kira," he said, and it was the first time he'd used her. First name. "You're doing well. Really." That night, returning home through Chicago's sleeping streets, Kira realized something had changed, not only in her career but also in herself. And though she was afraid to admit it even to herself, she knew Carson Morrison was beginning to occupy a place in her thoughts that had nothing to do with work. Continuing in next response. Story approximately 50% complete. Remaining sections include romantic dinner revealing personal histories, rooftop, love confession, workplace gossip and Kira's voluntary demotion, 6 months proving herself independently, dramatic return with board vote, public declaration of their relationship at company gala, rooftop proposal with engagement ring, epilogue celebrating their love triumph over corporate politics. The dinner that changed everything. 2 months had passed since the day Kira accepted Carson's proposal. Chicago was slowly waking from winter sleep, and the first signs of spring appeared on the streets. Trees in parks released shy buds, and the air lost that sharp, frosty edge that had accompanied the city for the last weeks. Kira noticed these changes during her morning walks to the office, but her thoughts were elsewhere. The marketing department was undergoing a transformation no one had expected. The first campaigns developed under her leadership were beginning to bring results. Conversion rates had increased by 17% compared to the previous quarter. Social media engagement had doubled. The team, which recently had worked in an atmosphere of fear and frustration, now came to the office with energy and enthusiasm. But the real change concerned something much more personal. Meetings with Carson had become more frequent and longer. Initially, they were just short briefings about projects and strategies. Then they began to extend into coffee conversations, then shared dinners in the executive dining room. Until finally, one Friday evening, Carson suggested they go to dinner at a restaurant outside the office. They now sat across from each other in an elegant restaurant in the Gold Coast neighborhood, at a corner table with a view of the illuminated John Hancock Center. The waiter had just taken away their empty appetizer plates and filled their wine glasses with wine Carson had chosen without hesitation. Kira looked at him over her glass, watching how candlelight danced on his face. Over the last 2 months, she'd learned to read his subtle changes of expression. She knew now that a slight furrow of his brow meant intense thinking, not disapproval. That a shadow of a smile at the corner of his mouth was the highest compliment you could expect. That his steel eyes could be warm when no one else was watching. "Tell me about your childhood," she requested, surprising herself with this question. Carson raised an eyebrow. "That's an unexpected change of subject. For 2 months we've talked mainly about work. I'd like to learn something more about the man I work for." For a long moment he was silent, swirling wine in his glass. Kira was already thinking he wouldn't answer when he began speaking quietly, as if words were coming from him reluctantly. "My childhood was complicated," he said. "My father was absorbed with building the company. My mother tried to compensate, but she had her own demons, alcohol mainly. I grew up in a large house full of empty rooms and silence. I had everything I could want except one thing." "What?" Kira asked gently. "A sense that I was enough, that I was worth something, not because I was heir to the Morrison fortune, but because I was myself." He set down his glass and looked into her eyes. "That's why I went to Berlin. I wanted to prove I could achieve something on my own, without my father's name opening doors for me. It took me a while, but I finally succeeded." Kira felt a tightness in her throat. Over recent months, she'd seen Carson as an impenetrable man, self-confident and untouchable. Only now was she beginning to understand that under that armored facade hid someone who'd fought his own shadows. "My mother would have been impressed," she said quietly. "She always said true strength isn't the absence of weakness, but the courage to face them." Carson smiled slightly. "She was a wise woman. She lacked money, influence, and connections, but she had something money can't buy, a heart so big it could warm the whole world. Tell me about her." And Kira told about her mother, who'd worked as a nurse on night shifts, so she could walk her daughter to school in the morning. About how together they'd bake pierogies on Sunday afternoons, singing old American songs. About the illness that took her too quickly, leaving Kira alone with memories and a mortgage her mother had taken out so her daughter would have her own apartment. When she finished, tears glistened in her eyes, which she didn't try to hide. Carson reached his hand across the table and gently touched hers. It was their first physical contact, not counting accidental touches when passing documents. "Thank you for telling me about her," he said. "Now I understand where you get that strength." "What strength?" "The strength to get up every day and keep fighting, even when everything seems against you. That's not something you can learn. That's something you have to find in yourself. And you found it." Kira looked at his hand resting on hers and felt warmth radiating from this simple gesture. She knew they should maintain professional distance. She knew a relationship between supervisor and subordinate was a recipe for disaster. But in this moment, in this restaurant, by candlelight and with his eyes gazing into hers, all those rational arguments seemed distant and irrelevant. Carson withdrew his hand and cleared his throat. "We should order dessert," he said, but there was something new in his voice, a roughness, as if he himself was fighting something he couldn't express in words. The rest of the evening passed in an atmosphere of subtle tension. They talked about books, films, travels. They discovered both loved Italian cuisine and Scandinavian crime novels, that both preferred sunrises to sunsets, and that both had a weakness for old photographs. When they left the restaurant, Carson walked her to a taxi. They stood for a moment on the sidewalk, looking at each other in lamplight, and something unspoken hung between them. "Good night, Kira," he said, quietly. "Good night, Carson." It was the first time she'd addressed him by his first name, and they both noticed. He smiled slightly, that rare, genuine smile, and opened the taxi door for her. She got in, and he closed the door and watched as the car drove off into the night. The rooftop confession. The next days were torture. Kira tried to focus on work, but her thoughts kept returning to that evening, to the touch of his hand, to the warmth in his eyes, to everything that had been said, and everything that remained unspoken. Carson seemed to have a similar problem. During meetings, their eyes met more often than usual and held contact a fraction of a second too long. His voice softened when he addressed her directly, and though they maintained professional distance in others' presence, the air between them almost sparked with invisible energy. A week after that dinner, Kira sat in her office working on a presentation for the board when her phone vibrated. Message from Carson. "Meet me on the roof at 9 p.m. Her heart accelerated. The Morrison Tower roof was a place to which only a few had access, a space reserved for the most important guests and most private meetings. At 9 p.m., she took the elevator to the top floor and climbed stairs to the roof. The view that greeted her took her breath away. Chicago lay at her feet like a sea of twinkling lights, and overhead spread a sky studded with stars barely breaking through the urban glow. Carson stood at the railing with his back to her, looking at the city panorama. When he heard her steps, he turned, and for a moment, he simply looked at her. "Thank you for coming," he said. Kira approached closer and stood beside him. "What are we doing here?" "I have to tell you something," he replied, his voice tense as a string. "Something that hasn't given me peace for a week. Longer, actually." He turned to her and took a deep breath. "All my life I was taught that emotions are weakness, that business and feelings are two separate spheres that should never mix. I built walls around myself so no one could get close because I was convinced closeness meant pain." He took a step toward her. "And then I met you, and all those walls began crumbling one by one. I tried to prevent it. I told myself it was just professional admiration, just respect for your work. But I was lying to myself." "Kira," he said, his voice now barely a whisper, "I fell in love with you. I know this complicates everything. I know I'm your supervisor, and this crosses all boundaries. But I can't pretend anymore that I feel nothing." Kira stood motionless, feeling her heart pounding in her chest so hard she could almost hear its thudding. For a moment, she forgot how to speak, how to breathe, how to exist in a world that had just turned upside down. "Carson," she began, but he raised his hand. "You don't have to say anything. I don't expect any answer from you. I just had to say it because suffocating it inside was killing me slowly. If you don't feel the same, I'll understand. Nothing will change in our cooperation, I swear." Kira looked at him, at this man who was perceived by everyone as untouchable and who now stood before her exposed and defenseless. And in this moment she made a decision that would change everything. She took a step forward, raised her hand, and touched his cheek. She felt him hold his breath under her touch. "I fell in love with you too," she said quietly. "I tried to deny it. I told myself it was stupid, that it was impossible, that nothing good would come of it. But the heart doesn't listen to reason." Carson closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked like a man who'd just received a gift he hadn't dared ask for. Then he opened his eyes, leaned forward, and gently kissed her forehead. "It won't be easy," he whispered. "There will be gossip, accusations, suspicions. People will say you got promoted because we're together." "I know," she replied, "but I'll prove them wrong. With results, not words." They stood on the roof, embraced, looking at the city stretching beneath them, like a luminous map of possibilities. Kira knew from this moment nothing would be the same. She also knew a long road full of challenges and obstacles lay before them. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel fear. She felt hope. The coffee catastrophe. The next weeks were both wonderful and difficult. Kira and Carson decided to maintain discretion, not hiding their relationship, but not flaunting it publicly either. In the office, they remained professional, maintaining appropriate distance and communicating mainly on business matters. Their real life took place after hours, in restaurants, movie theaters, walks through Chicago parks, and in Kira's Logan Square apartment, which Carson loved for its authenticity and warmth. But sooner or later, the secret had to come out. It happened one Tuesday afternoon when Kira was walking down the corridor toward the conference room. She heard her name spoken in a hushed voice and stopped in front of half-open doors to the break room. "Everyone knows Matthews is sleeping with the boss," said a female voice she recognized as belonging to Alexandra Kowalski, HR department head. "You think that promotion came from talent? Please. It's the oldest trick in the book." Kira felt blood drain from her face. She stood motionless, unable to move, listening to the conversation continue. "And did you hear they're planning to go together to the conference in Detroit? Rooms next to each other. Can you imagine?" Kira finally gathered herself and moved on. Her steps were firm and determined, but inside she felt shattered into pieces. Everything she'd feared was coming true. Her achievements, her hard work, all of it was being reduced to gossip about a romance with the boss. That evening when she met Carson at his River North apartment, she told him what she'd heard. He sat beside her on the couch and listened in silence, his jaw clenching tighter with every word. "I'll destroy them for this," he said when she finished. Kira shook her head. "You can't. It will only confirm their suspicions that you're protecting me, that you're favoring me. So what should I do? Let them humiliate you?" "I have an idea," she replied, "but you won't like it." The resignation. Kira's idea was simple, but required courage. She decided to resign from the marketing director position and return to her previous assistant position. Only this way could she prove her relationship with Carson hadn't influenced her career. Carson was furious when she told him. He paced his apartment like a caged lion, gesticulating violently and repeating that it was absurd, that he wouldn't allow it, that those people weren't worth such sacrifice. Kira sat calmly on the couch and waited for him to finish. When he finally stopped and looked at her helplessly, she stood and approached him. "Listen to me carefully," she said, taking his hands in hers. "I'm not doing this for them. I'm doing this for myself. All my life I've fought to be appreciated for who I am, not who I know. If I stay in this position, there will always be a shadow of doubt. They'll always whisper I owe everything to you. I don't want to live like that. But you deserve this promotion. Your results speak for themselves. I know, and that's exactly why I'll return to the top by my own strength, without any doubts, without any gossip. I'll give myself 6 months. I'll return to the assistant position and work even harder than before. And when the next promotion opportunity comes, no one will be able to say I got it because of you." Carson looked at her for a long time, and in his steel eyes was a mixture of admiration and frustration. Finally, he sighed heavily and pulled her to him. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met," he mumbled into her hair. "I know," she replied with a smile. "That's why you love me." The spilled coffee. The next day, Kira submitted her resignation from the director position. News spread through the company at lightning speed, causing a wave of speculation and astonishment. Some claimed Carson had fired her, others that they'd fought and broken up. Alexandra Kowalski from HR walked the corridors with a triumphant smile, convinced her gossip had led to her rival's downfall. But Kira paid no attention. She returned to her old desk in the open space and got to work with determination that surprised everyone. She came first and left last. She took on the most difficult projects and executed them flawlessly. She helped colleagues, shared knowledge, built relationships based on respect and competence. 3 months passed, then 4. Results of the marketing department, now led by an external consultant hired by Carson, began to decline. Campaigns Kira had designed before leaving still brought results, but new initiatives didn't match her standards. The board began to worry. At the end of the 5th month, Carson called an extraordinary board meeting. Kira wasn't invited, but that evening Carson told her everything during dinner at her Logan Square apartment. I presented the board with a full analysis of marketing department results, he said, cutting the steak Kira had prepared. Comparison of the period when you led the department with what's happening now. The numbers speak for themselves. 23% growth under your leadership, 11% decline under the consultant. And what did they say? Kira asked, trying to hide her emotions. Carson smiled. They voted unanimously for your return as director. But there's one condition. What? You must decide yourself if you want to return. No one's forcing you. If you prefer to stay in the assistant position, the board will accept it. The decision is yours. Kira set down her fork and looked at him. She knew this was the moment she'd been waiting for. The moment when she could return to the top without any doubts, without any whispers behind her back. The results spoke for themselves. No one could now claim she owed anything to her relationship with Carson. I'm returning, she said, but under one condition. What? I want you to announce our relationship publicly. No more hiding, no more pretending. If I'm returning, it's as a woman who's with you, not because it helps her career, but because she loves you. Carson stood, walked around the table and knelt by her chair. He took her hand and kissed it gently. I thought you'd never ask, he said with a smile. But then, on the day of her official return announcement, disaster struck. Kira was carrying 2 cups of coffee, one for herself, one for Carson, when Alexandra Kowalski deliberately stepped into her path in the corridor. Oh, back to serving coffee to the boss? Alexandra said loudly so everyone could hear. Kira tried to step around her, but Alexandra moved again, blocking her way. Some things never change. You're still just the boss's little assistant, aren't you? Something inside Kira snapped. 3 months of holding her tongue. 3 months of enduring whispers and looks. 3 months of proving herself while people like Alexandra spread poison. Get out of my way, Kira said quietly but firmly. Or what? You'll have your boyfriend fire me? Kira took a step forward, but Alexandra moved at the same moment, and the coffee cups tilted. Hot coffee splashed all over Carson Morrison, who'd just appeared around the corner, drenching his expensive white shirt and charcoal suit jacket. The corridor went silent. Carson stood there, coffee dripping from his clothes, looking at the scene with an expression that made Alexandra pale. Ms. Kowalski, he said in that ice-cold voice. My office. Now. But before Alexandra could move, Kira did something no one expected. She took off her ID badge and placed it on the nearest desk. I quit, she said, looking Carson straight in the eyes. I won't work at a company where people like her are allowed to poison the atmosphere while I have to prove myself over and over again just because I fell in love with you. She turned and walked toward the elevators. Kira, wait! Carson called after her. But she didn't stop. She pressed the elevator button and waited, her back straight, refusing to show how much she was shaking inside. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in, and just before the doors closed, she heard Carson's voice. Not angry, not commanding, but raw and honest. You're mine. Kira Matthews, and I'm not letting you walk away. The elevator doors closed. Continuing in final response. Story approximately 85% complete. Remaining sections include Carson's dramatic pursuit, public declaration at board meeting revealing Alexandra's sabotage, Kira's return with full board support, company gala with love declaration, rooftop proposal under stars, epilogue with wedding announcement and their triumph showing that authentic love withstands all corporate politics. Chase. Kira stood in the elevator, tears streaming down her face, her whole body shaking with emotion. What had she just done? She'd walked away from the man she loved, from the job she'd fought for, from everything. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. But before she could step out, she heard pounding footsteps on the stairs. The stairwell door burst open and Carson appeared. Still dripping with coffee, his expensive suit ruined, but his eyes blazing with an intensity that made her breath catch. No, he said simply, walking toward her. No, you don't get to walk away. Not like this. Not ever. Carson, I can't, she started. You're right, he interrupted, stopping in front of her. You're absolutely right. You shouldn't have to work in a place where people like Alexandra poison the atmosphere. You shouldn't have to prove yourself over and over. You shouldn't have to endure whispers and gossip. He took her hands in his, not caring that they were in the middle of the lobby, that security guards were watching, that other employees were gathering to see what was happening. So I'm going to fix it, he said. Right now. Come with me. Where? To the board meeting that's happening right now. The truth revealed. 5 minutes later, Kira found herself in the 30th floor boardroom, facing the entire Morrison Industries board of directors. Carson stood beside her, coffee-stained, but radiating authority. Gentlemen, he addressed the shocked board. Members, I've called you here for an emergency session regarding workplace harassment and the creation of a hostile work environment. He clicked a remote, and the screen behind him lit up with security camera footage. For the past 3 months, Ms. Alexandra Kowalski from HR has been conducting a systematic campaign of harassment against Ms. Kira Matthews. I have documentation of 17 separate incidents where Ms. Kowalski has spread false information about Ms. Matthews' relationship with me, questioned her professional competence, and created a hostile work environment. The footage showed Alexandra's whispered conversations, her deliberate blocking of Kira in the corridor, her triumphant smiles when Kira resigned as director. Ms. Matthews voluntarily stepped down from the director position 3 months ago, specifically to prove that her relationship with me had no bearing on her professional achievements. During that time, under external management, the marketing department's performance declined by 11%. Under Ms. Matthews' leadership, it had grown by 23%. He pulled up charts and graphs showing the stark contrast. The board has already voted unanimously to offer Ms. Matthews the director position again. But before she makes that decision, I want to address something else. Carson turned to face Kira, and in his steel blue eyes was everything he felt. No walls, no armor, just raw, honest emotion. Kira Matthews, I love you. I fell in love with you the day you stood up to your incompetent supervisor in front of me. I fell in love with your courage, your integrity, your refusal to accept anything less than you deserve. Our relationship has never been about business. It's been about 2 people who found something in each other they didn't even know they were looking for. He turned back to the board. If this company cannot support a relationship between 2 professionals who happen to fall in love, then I don't want to lead it. If this company tolerates people like Alexandra Kowalski creating hostile environments while punishing people like Kira Matthews for having integrity, then I don't want to be part of it. He looked back at Kira. So here's what's going to happen. Alexandra Kowalski is fired, effective immediately, for harassment and creating a hostile work environment. Kira Matthews is offered the position of marketing director, with my full support and the board's full support, with no conditions attached to our relationship. And if anyone in this company has a problem with that, they can bring it to me personally. The boardroom was silent. Then one of the older board members, Mr. Harrison, stood up. Mr. Morrison, your father built this company on principles of integrity and merit. What you've shown us today proves you understand those principles better than he ever did. Ms. Matthews has my full support, and I believe I speak for the entire board when I say we're honored to have both of you leading this company forward. One by one, the other board members stood and applauded. Kira stood there, tears streaming down her face, unable to believe what had just happened. Carson took her hand. So what do you say, Ms. Matthews? Will you take the job? Will you take me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice? Kira looked at him, at this man who'd just put his entire career on the line for her, who'd stood in front of the board dripping with coffee to defend her honor, who'd chased her down 6 flights of stairs because he couldn't let her walk away. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes. The gala. A week later, during the official gala celebrating Morrison Industries' 25th anniversary, Carson stood before the microphone and gave a speech that would go down in company history. He spoke about the past and future, about challenges and successes, and at the end, he asked Kira to join him on stage. This woman, he said, holding her hand, taught me something no business school could ever teach me. That true strength isn't about building walls, but about having the courage to tear them down. That success without the people we care about is empty, and that love isn't weakness, but the greatest strength we can possess. I love this woman, and I'm proud to stand beside her, not as CEO and employee, not as billionaire and assistant, but as 2 people who found in each other something worth fighting for. The room fell silent. For a moment, then erupted in applause. Kira stood beside Carson, feeling the warmth of his hand and the warmth of people's gazes, people who finally saw them as they truly were. The proposal. After the gala, when the guests had dispersed and the hall stood empty, Carson led Kira to the roof of Morrison Tower, the same place where he'd confessed his love months earlier. "I have something for you," he said, pulling a small box from his pocket. Kira felt her heart stop for a fraction of a second. Carson opened the box, revealing a ring with a single diamond that sparkled in the starlight. "Kira Matthews," he said, looking into her eyes, "will you marry me?" Tears streamed down her cheeks as she answered with the only word that mattered: "Yes." Carson slipped the ring on her finger and kissed her gently. They stood embraced on the Morrison Tower roof, with Chicago twinkling beneath their feet and an infinity of possibilities stretching before them. Kira thought about her mother, who'd always said true strength was the courage to face your fears. She thought about herself a year ago, the terrified assistant who hadn't dared dream of something more. And she thought about the future, which now appeared bright and full of promise. 6 months later, the wedding took place on a spring morning in a small chapel on Chicago's north side, the same chapel where Kira's mother had gotten married decades before. Eva stood as maid of honor. The Morrison Industries board members filled the pews. Sophie from the marketing department dabbed her eyes with tissues, and when Carson lifted Kira's veil and kissed her as hundreds of cherry blossom petals fell around them, he'd had them flown in from Japan just for this moment. Everyone present knew they were witnessing something rare and precious, a love that had survived corporate politics, gossip, separation, and doubt, a love that proved when two people see each other's true worth, nothing else matters. As they walked down the aisle hand in hand, Kira thought about that morning a year ago, when she'd stood in front of Carson Morrison with coffee-stained hands and resignation on her lips. She'd thought it was the end. It had been the beginning, and Carson, looking at his bride with those steel-blue eyes now warm with love, thought about what he'd said to her that day in the elevator lobby. "You're mine, Kira Matthews." He'd been right. She was his, and he was hers, forever. If this story made your heart race, remember, standing up for yourself is never a mistake. Walking away when your dignity is at stake is never weakness. And the right person will chase you down 6 flights of stairs, stand before a board of directors dripping with coffee, and put their entire career on the line to prove you're worth fighting for. Share this with someone who needs to know that authentic love sees your value, even when you're at your lowest, that corporate politics can't defeat genuine connection, and that sometimes the biggest disasters lead to the most beautiful beginnings. Subscribe if you believe in love that fights back, in partners who defend your honor, in second chances that turn into forever, and in coffee spills that change destiny. Because sometimes all it takes is one moment of standing your ground, one person brave enough to chase you, and one love strong enough to withstand anything the world throws at it.